subscribers, and thank you for tuning in, and thank you for being here. We are going to continue our discussion with Michael Coffman about global warming and how this connects to the idea of global governance and the plans for a, centralized one world government structure. There's lots of evidence here, or lots of hints here, that seems to connect with this agenda and global warming, of course. And one thing I'd like to begin to ask you here, Michael, is when did you kind of first begin to recognize or pick up on the fact that the global warming agenda, so to speak, could possibly then connect with this alternative agenda and kind of hiding behind this idea?
Well, it was back in the early 1990s, actually late 1980s and early 1990s, when I was leading the multi-million-dollar research effort on the effects of global warming on our nation's ecosystems. I was involved in trying to find out exactly what was going to happen as we had the warming and so forth that was being predicted at that time, which we have had in effect. We've had warming since the Little Ice Age back in the 1800s, which is nothing to be surprised, but at the same time, it does affect our nation's ecosystems and our ability to grow crops, wood, any other resources involved in plant material. And in that process, I was working with a lot of I also have a background in meteorology, and I was working with a lot of climate scientists, and the efforts that they were doing just did not show conclusively that man was causing global warming, and that has not changed any today either. And as a consequence, as I began to realize that we're putting a tremendous amount of money into an issue that really can't be demonstrated scientifically, so I began to delve into why. What is driving this agenda? And not only that, but on the ecosystem side of it, I was very much involved in the biodiversity issue, and biodiversity is important, don't get me wrong, but the theories being developed at the international level about biodiversities were just not right. And I got to thinking, what in the world is driving the political institutions of this world to come up with these conclusions when the science just doesn't really support it? And it wasn't long, it didn't take me much effort at all to find that the whole effort was to try to develop a web of international institutions through treaties and other types of activities, agreements, to create what is called global governance. Now, they don't use the word government because that implies that they have absolute control. Rather, they want to set up a system of international institutions. Here in the United States, we have what is called the Environmental Protection Agency that oversees our environment and our health and so forth here in this country. But they're directly responsible to the Congress of the United States, which is directly responsible to the people of the United States. The institutions that they were establishing at the international level were accountable to no one. And this is really what concerned me the most. There is an effort in the United Nations, for instance, to create a whole other institution called it's escaping my mind right now, but it's basically a global environmental protection agency of sorts that would have the authority to dictate to nations what they can and cannot do in order to remain environmentally conscious, both in global warming as well as ecosystem protection and so forth. This was very alarming. When you start having international institutions telling you what you can do with your economy and what you cannot do with your economy, you've basically lost control over your own destiny. And this is what concerned me the most, I think, almost of anything.
So do you think that this could be kind of a how should I put it, a legal way around to kind of bypass national sovereignty then?
Yes, I really honestly do. I think that they realized many years ago, this has been ongoing for well over 100 years. This is nothing new. They tried to create the League of Nations, and if you look at some of the documents out of the League of Nations, the ultimate goal was to create a world government. In the background, some of the people that advanced the United Nations on their private moments and so forth talked about creating a world government. And they have failed in both instances. The people of the world did not want. It's not that I'm not opposed to, or that I'm opposed to some sort of a world government. It's just that the way that they're developing is that there is no accountability to the leadership in this government to the people of the world. And as a consequence, I'm diametrically opposed to that approach to having world government.
Well, go ahead.
Too much control at the top levels and almost no control at the local levels where it affects the people.
Sure, I see what you're saying, and my kind of, I agree with you there, because my question here is, who is in charge of that global, governance or government, whatever, however we want to put it. I mean, to a certain degree, I guess that a one world, kind of overseeing structure that can make sure that nations don't war upon each other and things like this. I mean, that's a good thing, but I mean, again, who is controlling this legally? How potentially if some kind of I don't know, fascist dictator or whatever were to come in control of this international body, then we're potentially in a lot of trouble,
Absolutely. And there are no checks and balances in the evolving architecture of these international treaties and international organizations that are going to have a say on what we can and cannot do. And without any checks and balances, it's very easy. In fact, you're going to have despots and totalitarian type people, tyrants and so forth, vying for that position, and they're going to want control, absolute control over everybody's life. That's the history of tyrants throughout all of history. And as a consequence, we need to have checks and balances, and what is evolving in the United Nations under the auspices of global governance does not give us the checks and balances that would prevent that.
And they're using kind of a very, I guess, emotional aspect of this too, because, I mean, who in their right mind would be against, the polluting and the destruction of our planet, right? Absolutely.
In fact, I'm the one out in the front lines when it comes to clean water and clean air and so forth. But when you have a situation where they're using that emotional appeal to advance a totally hidden agenda called global governance, is when I get alarmed and say, no, we need to have clean air and clean water, but this is not the way to do it. There are better ways of doing it where you have accountability of those who are over the people to the people themselves.
That's right. And one thing that kind of is bugging me also with all of this is that we hear very little, at least at this point, about how much, pollution and how much, in that sense, if we were to speak from their perspective, so to speak, for instance, about wars, about military development. We hear very little about the space program and all the, the pollutants that release into our atmosphere. So it seems to be that it's only kind of certain areas that are pinpointed, and mainly it seems to be kind of, quote here, the little guy that is being targeted here, right?
And that's what I'm very much concerned about, because there is a very, very definite link. Now, I'm not saying that corporations are evil. Don't get me wrong. I used to work for a corporation, and it was a very good institution for me to work for. But what happens when you have corporations joining partnerships with these public-private partnerships with governmental agencies, you have a form of fascism, if you want to use that word, in which you have big corporations in bed with the government agencies, which then pass regulations, as they're doing right now, as you're suggesting, that really are not uniform across the needs that exist out there to protect our environment, but are targeted towards specific things that will not hurt the corporations, but will give strength to those corporations and keep the small guy that's, the mom and pop operation in those areas from ever gaining a financial foothold. And so it becomes basically a monopoly where you have a few international organizations, corporations that are controlling the food production, controlling transportation, controlling, name it, in various aspects of our economies. And the small guy that wants to enter those fields can't get in because of all the regulations that this public-private partnership between international corporations and the government have created that work against the small person or the small company.
Yeah, exactly. And, then we have a few other things here also to kind of take into the equation, so to speak. We have one idea here about take the oil, for example. What is it? It's about up to $100 a barrel now for oil, right?
Yes.
So what do you think that is all about? Who is pumping up the prices? Why? Is that a good or a bad thing in the end? What do you think about it?
Well, obviously, one of the things that affects all of us is the cost of transportation, the cost of manufacturing and so forth, which is directly related to the cost of oil. And as a consequence, everything is going up in price. It's becoming more difficult for you and I and the average person to buy the materials that we need on a day-to-day basis, let alone any little luxurious item that we might want to purchase. So what we have here is an escalating oil crisis. I've done a major bit of research on the oil resources of the world, and we do not have an oil shortage. Yes, we have a 30-year supply projection and so forth, but that's been in existence since the mid-20th century. They've always said we only had 10 or 15 years worth of oil, and there is plenty of oil out there, especially when you talk about the oil shale area of the United States and Canada and other potential sources of oil. In fact, they're now getting highly suspicious that oil doesn't come really from fossils, and it's not really fossil fuel. It's actually a process that's happening in the middle of the earth with methane, and super pressures and temperatures and so forth, because a lot of the oil fields that we thought were abandoned and depleted are now filling back up again. But
you're talking about abiotic oil, right?
The abiotic oil, that's correct. And I don't know how much that's going to be playing a role, but we don't have a major oil shortage. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't be looking for alternatives. I think there's always a need for looking for alternatives to oil for our energy sources and so forth. But oil is directly tied to the economy of every single human being on planet Earth. And as a consequence, if you control oil, you control the activities of the people. And this, again, is artificially created. Here in the United States, our environmental organizations are so powerful, and I think this is probably true in Europe too, but you can tell me if I'm wrong, that they have actually prevented the creation of any new refinery in the United States since the 1970s. They have passed legislation and so forth that makes it impossible for a refinery to be built. And as a consequence, we have a bottleneck. And much of the shortage that we're experiencing here in the United States comes from a lack of refinery capability. In Europe, you're getting a lot of oil now from Russia. That's politically linked to Vladimir Putin or whoever is in power at that particular time. It's his whims as to what he's going to turn off the spigot or not turn off the spigot. Oil is a political entity that is being used by a lot of different power factions in the world right now to manipulate things to their advantage. And, of course, it's the little guy, you and I, that always winds up holding the bag.
What do you pay for a gallon of gasoline over there right now? In
U.S. dollars, it's now about $3.20.
Okay, $3.20. I'm going to do the math on this later and just do comparative with how much it costs in Sweden. But anyway, I just wanted to get that. Thank you. This is obviously one idea here that this affects the economy, and I agree with you. And at the same time, I can't help to kind of see the other issue or the other side of this coin, so to speak, and that is that what you just mentioned, that of course is it such a bad idea to actually go away from fossil fuels? We have potentially, if it is not true that oil is abiotic and so forth, we're having potentially wars being fought over because of oil reserves and so forth.
Yes.
But then we have the other point here, and that is through kind of, how should I put it, not tragedy perhaps, but through kind of tough times or rough times, man, gets off his ass, so to speak, can actually do something about it, and potentially we have a lot of people that are very innovative, inventors and so forth, that are coming up with new ideas. We have magnetic motors, we have water and hydrogen motors, potentially even zero-point energy, and in conjunction with kind of new technology coming online, like levitation, if we're talking about superconductivity, or even zero-G. Potentially we could, enter into a whole new area of technology, and this and what we're seeing now with this global warming issue is kind of the catalyst